Is evil evidence against God or evidence for God? You may be surprised that in this interview, we're going to look at 3 arguments for the conclusion that evil is actually evidence for God. My guest is Daryl Ooi. He is a doctoral candidate at, remind me of the university?
National University of Singapore.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And the paper that we'll be discussing is titled Theistic Arguments from Horrendous Evils. So thank you very much for joining me, Daryl.
Thanks for having me, Jordan.
All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. How did you become interested in this topic?
I guess in my research work, I've been thinking very much on different approaches and traditions where the problem of evil arise. So my thesis is on the problem of evil in David Hume. I've written something on the problem of evil in Chinese philosophy, in the Mencius, and some stuff on practical theodicy as well. In the midst of doing research onto some of these areas, I think it was initially surprising when I came across a bunch of papers that seemed to sort of provide or advance theistic arguments from horrendous evils. It was, I guess, obviously surprising, right? Because typically horrendous evils are used as evidence against the existence of God, right? But at the same time, these arguments were advanced by philosophers whom I deeply respect, people like Alvin Plantinga, people like Marilyn Adams, and there's a sense in which it was then interesting, right? I think my colleague described this as a plot twist, so to speak, to then think of to sort of clarify some of these arguments advanced by these philosophers and to see whether there's any weight to them.
Yeah. Well, I'm eager to see how these arguments go. Okay, so before we look at the 3 specific arguments, what are some preliminaries or clarifications that you'd like to make about the arguments?
Good. Thanks for that. So I guess in the course of speaking with colleagues and friends about this, I found some preliminaries particularly helpful. The first thing to note is that in my view, these arguments are sort of better understood as argument strategies than arguments itself. As we go through the argument strategies, you'll see that in many cases, there are details that still need to be filled in and various ways to sort of input various data to sort of strengthen these arguments. Yeah, and there are sort of obviously different ways to sort of play around with this argument, right? So I'll say a bit more as we go along. The other thing worth noting is that my task in this paper was to sort of clarify some of these arguments that are out there, right? And in many cases, these arguments are not, I think, the strongest versions of the argument, right? So when it comes to the first argument we are going to talk about, it's, they're from 4 different sort of articles from Alvin Plantinga, where he himself, right, says something like, I think there's something here, this needs working out. I can sketch this at an intuitive level. And in a sense, I think it's worth taking these arguments at that level, right? So these are sort of nice introductions to these argument strategies. And one of the things that I want to do is to think of ways that these arguments may be challenged, may be developed. And certainly one of the goals is to invite anyone who finds these arguments interesting to think of ways to sort of further develop them as well.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, if you wanted to continue the preliminaries, go ahead.
Finally, there's I've written a teaching and learning guide with Compass that should be coming out pretty soon, right? So those interested in exploring this a bit further, I highly encourage you to take a look at that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. After we finish this interview, if you want to provide a link, which it may not come out for a little while, but I guess when it comes out, if you want to give me a link, I can put it in the comments on the video. All right.
Great.
Well, let's look at the first argument here. And probably, if this is okay with you, what I'll do is I'll read the argument
Okay.
fully, and then
Yeah.
you can unpack it as much as you'd like from there. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, so the first argument is the argument from objectively horrifying evils. Here's how it goes. Premise 1. There is real and objectively horrifying evil in the world. Premise 2. Theism has more resources than naturalism to explain one. Conclusion, therefore, theism is preferable to naturalism. Okay, so unpack this argument for us.
All right. So maybe it's worth saying that this sort of is an argument sketch from 4 different works that I think Plantinga has. And I kind of want to put it out in case people are interested in those papers, right? So I think in 97, he wrote a spiritual autobiography called A Christian Life Partly Lived. He has his famous 24 or so theistic arguments. He has an encyclopedia entry on the arguments for the existence of God. And sort of the fourth one that I found came in a letter he wrote to Peter van Inwagen. So those are kind of interesting. And what he does is he provides various sketches, various ways of thinking about this argument. And one of the things that I'm trying to do here is to sort of formulate them, clarify them, pull them together. Yeah. So let's talk about the first premise. So the first, perhaps it's worth noting that in all the arguments, the term horrendous evils may be used slightly differently. And I'll say a bit about what I mean as we go through. Right. So what does Plantinga, for example, take to be what he calls objectively horrifying evil? There are at least 2 features. So first, for him, objectively horrifying evil tends to involve this idea of human cruelty or wickedness. So when you think of moral evils, right, as opposed to natural evils, when you think of moral evils, things like the Nazi concentration camp, things like what went on in Pol Pot's regime, things like the story of the young child hanging in the gallows in Kenneth Surin's work. There's a sense in which Plantinga thinks that our objection to these events are not just that there's a ton of pain and suffering in them, right? Indeed, there is a ton of pain and suffering in them. But in addition to that, he thinks that there's a certain amount of perversion and cruelty there, which can only be understood as human cruelty and human wickedness, right? So that's the first feature of what he takes to be objectively horrifying evils. A second feature is that they are independent of any individual's perspective, right? So in this case, these kinds of evil will remain evil even if he says everyone came to perversely approve of them at some point. Yeah, so you have these 2 ways of thinking about objectively horrifying evil, and that gets you premise 1. Yeah, so if you do think that this category exists, then the question that arises is how may we formulate an argument for premise 2? Yeah. So Plantinga, I think, provides at least 3 different ways to do this by observing 3 different moral phenomena. Each of these on their own may be taken as an argument in favor of theism against naturalism, but they may also be taken together as a cumulative case, right? So the first feature is that the concept of objectively horrifying evils requires some strong version of moral realism or moral objectivity. And Plantinga thinks that theism explains this best. Secondly, the concept of objectively horrifying evils requires some strong moral obligation or moral normativity. And then you might ask, how strong? And he defines this quite specifically. So he thinks that the force of the normativity that we are concerned about is such that the horrific nature of genuine wickedness is its inverse, right? So in the sense that if you think that these evils are horrifying on a cosmic level, then it seems to suggest that the obligations are equally strong on a cosmic level as well, right? And he thinks that theism then explains this best. Yeah, so that's the second moral phenomenon. The third one is the idea of human wickedness, right? So he thinks that when we try and examine when we reflect on what we take, why we tend to think that human wickedness is horrifying, why we think that it's particularly appalling. Theism explains this best. And what's his explanation? He says something like, um, there is a certain cosmic significance to such evil, which makes it particularly horrifying, right? So in this case, evil is defined in terms of violating and inverting the true scale of values, which he finds to be God's goodness, right? So the concern here is not just that there is wickedness, but that there is wickedness and a certain amount of horrificness at sort of the cosmic level, right? And then he thinks that theism explains that best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you
Okay.
want to say anything else before we look at maybe some objections to the argument?
It might be worth noting that in general, the argument is for a broad kind of theism, at least as I've sketched it. But at least in one place, Elvin Plantinga suggests that the best kind of theism that can do this job is the Christian God. And that itself is, I think, interesting, right? So one way that you may think of developing this argument, and maybe we can say a bit about that later on, is to clarify the kind of theism that we're concerned about. Yeah, certain theisms may fare better, and some certain theisms may fare worse on this account. Yeah.
Yes, that reminds me a lot of the interview that I did with Dr. Ann Jeffrey, where she says something like bare theism or mere theism isn't enough for many moral arguments. You have to
Yeah.
start adding in more specific features. So, okay, that's helpful. Now, what objections or what kind of pushback do you talk about in the paper?
Good. So maybe I'll mention a couple, and then we can chat about any of them that you think is interesting. Um, one immediate response I think that people have is to deny moral realism. Right? There's this idea that moralism is dead. This idea that it's not a popular view, right? And there's a lot to say about this, right? So that's a potential challenge, right? If you get off the moral realist bandwagon, one of the things that may be worth pointing out was so I was kind of interested in this question: what do philosophers generally think? And so in 2020, they did a Phil paper survey with philosophers, and just above 60% of professional philosophers who did the survey claim to accept or lean towards moral realism, right? And so that doesn't suggest that moral realism is true, but it does suggest that there's something there that may be worth thinking about, right? So one way to sort of develop then this idea of moral realism is that you may provide independent arguments for moral realism and moral objectivity, right? And there's a ton of these arguments in the literature as well. I think one important advantage of this argument is that when you reflect on horrifying evils, as opposed to, say, smaller kinds of evils, the intuition of objectivity, of realism, is a lot stronger as well, right? So that's one way to sort of develop this argument. If you think that you want to add a bit more sort of cachet to the idea of moral realism, you may sort of input, right, other independent arguments for moral realism into, I suppose, premise two. Another concern is whether sorry, did you have a
I
follow-up?
may make one comment there.
Yeah.
If someone goes, if the objection to this argument that Plantinga gives is a denial of moral realism, I guess depending on, so to deny moral realism I don't think it necessarily commits you to nihilism.
No.
There's going to be some other options there. But depending on how one, I guess, goes about picking an alternative view, among the options that are left, it may be that you're not going to be able to endorse at least certain versions, maybe all versions of the problem of evil. It seems like arguments from evil are going to depend on the existence of evil of some variety. And this is where you may say, well, if I have a kind of maybe more subjective view or something like that, then maybe you can still run an argument from evil. And you might just drop language of evil altogether and talk about just suffering. But it just seems like that sort of objection is going to limit how you can run arguments from evil. That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I think I say somewhere in the conclusion of the paper that one feature of why I think this particular argument is interesting is that many theists and atheists can agree that horrendous evils exist, right? Which often is the thing that motivates problems of evil, as you say. Perhaps if I were to sort of defend someone who denies moralism, who wants to sort of run problem of evil arguments, I may say something like, the kind of reason that I'm providing is an ironic reason, right? So Michael Lynch talks about this, where in order for me to say that horrendous evils provide some argument against the existence of God, I don't have to endorse horrendous evils, because all I'm saying is that the theist is being inconsistent in endorsing horrendous evils and endorsing some version of God as well. So I suppose atheists who deny this may still be able to sort of quite successfully run the argument without endorsing the premise. I'm not sure if, yeah.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So that's one type of objection to the argument, is to deny moral realism. Are there other ones that you discuss?
Yeah, so there are a couple. So the other obvious question is whether theism really does provide a better explanation for the existence of objectively horrifying evils. And so maybe let me start with the challenge, right? So one way to challenge this account is to provide alternative accounts of theories of objective morality without God, right? And there are a number of these in the literature. Schaefer Landau, Shelley Kagan, my colleague Neil Sinababu as well, run such arguments, and those are interesting. And in a sense, if you want sort of to challenge this premise, what you want to do is you don't just need to provide an alternative account. You should show that the alternative account is preferable to the theistic account. Yeah. And maybe another way to sort of challenge this argument as it currently stands is to provide various alternatives, right? So in this case, we have theism and naturalism as two alternatives, but you might think that there are some positions that are non-theistic, non-naturalistic, or theistic naturalists, or other kinds of theisms as well that fit this bill, right? And that itself might be an interesting project. To sort of develop different kinds of theisms, and to play with the different ways you think of theism and see how that kind of affects the argument. So in response to this, I have several suggestions on how, if someone is interested, they may develop this particular premise. So one of which is to as we say, sort of consider whether it's relevant, the kind of theism that we're concerned about. I think this is what you were mentioning from the book by Anne Jeffries, right? I think it's God and Morality or something like that.
Yes.
Where you may think that it does in fact matter what kind of theism you're concerned about. And so it then may be interesting to sort of consider whether certain theisms fare better and certain theisms fare worse than naturalism in explaining the existence of objectively horrifying evils. I would say that Alvin Plantinga himself provides an independent argument for this, and it's worth checking that out if you're interested. So the paper, I think, is called Naturalism, Theism, Obligation, and Supervenience. And I'm happy to send you a link to that paper as well, if that's useful.
Yeah.
And I think maybe one other way to develop this argument is to add in what you might call bridging arguments, right? So bridging arguments are just other ways, I think, that um, you can find a link between God and morality. And there's a ton of various ways to do this, right? You can examine. So there's a whole cluster of arguments. I think they're called, you might call them theistic arguments from morality. I think Anne Jeffries does a good job sort of giving a survey of these arguments. Robert Adams has a wonderful survey as well. And these arguments tend to begin with certain moral phenomena, right? Things like moral obligation, moral accountability, moral realism, moral goodness, and so on and so forth, and argue that the best explanation for these, for the existence of such moral phenomena, is a specific kind of God, right? So that's you may bring in independent bridging arguments to then sort of support premise two. Yeah.
Okay. For the sake of time, we might want to go ahead and move on to the next type of argument for the existence of God from evil. Is that okay if we move on?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So this next argument, I'll read out the pragmatic argument from evil. And it goes like this. 1. Horrendous evils exist. 2. If horrendous evils exist, robust realism demands confrontation with the fact that the world is filled with evils of the life-ruining kind. 3. If we adopt robust realism, we also either A, believe in a horror defeater, or B, we do not believe in a horror defeater. 4. If 3A, then adopting a posture of optimism makes much sense. For example, optimistic, entrenched practices and attitudes. 5. If 3B, then adopting a posture of optimism makes little sense. 6. Therefore, if 1, 2, 3, and we want to adopt a posture of optimism, it follows that we ought to believe in a horror defeater.
Okay. Yeah, good. Thanks for that. So this is a really fun argument. I think I get quite a lot of different responses when I run this argument. So it's worth saying that I think this argument is part of Marilyn Adams' sort of larger project, right, on the horrendous evils and the goodness of God. It's worth noting that this argument might be slightly different from standard theistic arguments, in the sense that Adams clearly states at the start that she runs this as an ad hominem argument. So it's an argument, in this sense, directed at agnostics and atheists with certain entrenched attitudes, and/or, right, they participate in entrenched practices of optimism and hope, right? So they think that there are certain overall life projects of meaning making that are worth pursuing. Right. And so one easy way to sort of get out of this argument is just to reject this idea of optimism, to say that it's not something that we want. And Adams from the start says, that's fine, then you're not the target of my argument. Right. So she's targeting a really specific group of people, but it's not a small group as well, right? Because she thinks that robust realism about horrendous evils requires us to be confronted with the fact that horrendous evils exist all around us. Okay, so what does she mean by horrendous evils, right? It's worth pointing out, I think, that Adams' version of horrendous evils is slightly different from Alvin Plantinga's objectively horrifying evils. So for Adams, she defines horrendous evils as evils the participation in the doing or suffering of which constitutes prima facie reason to doubt whether the participant's life could, given the inclusion of said evil, sort of be a great good to him or her on the whole. Right, so you notice that immediately from the outset that her definition of horrendous evils would include things like natural evils, while Plantinga's version does not. Right, and I say a bit more about the differences later on. And so she says, if you think about the world that we live in, and if we were to adopt a certain kind of robust realism about horrendous evils, we'll be confronted with the fact that many of us are in some ways invariably complicit in some ways perpetrators of, and in some ways victims of horrendous evils, right? That is, we face and experience and maybe inadvertently participate in the production of evils that may appear to ruin people's lives, right? So being confronted with this fact, she says, it gives us a big concern, right, about whether we can be optimistic about our life projects, or whether we should be optimistic about our life projects. Maybe one way to put, so I pulled out a sort of nice quote from her to sort of get this intuition going, and so to think of horrendous evils, right? Here's some examples she gives. Think of the father who non-negligently and accidentally runs over the little son who has been the light of his life, and he may reasonably wonder who he can be now, how he can go on, how he can do anything more to survive. Cases of depression may rob life of its flavor, prevent those who suffer from it from experiencing anything around them as good. Soldiers and civilians may be traumatized by war. They may lose their ability to order their lives in a coherent narrative. And I think the next line makes it really clear what she's trying to get at. She says that horrors then tend to interrupt or terrorize and terrify them again and again. Right? So because horrors, the experience of horrors, whether you're a participant, right, whether you're complicit in it, or whether you're a perpetrator or a victim, it tends to be the kind of thing that terrorizes us constantly in life, right? It's not something that's easy to forget. And if it has the potential to sort of ruin, be the evils of the life-ruining kind, it gives us reason to wonder whether a world without a horror defeater can ultimately be meaningful, right? Give us reason to pursue such projects. So I think that's the in a nutshell, I think that's the argument that she gives. Sorry, I think you're muted.
Oh, I apologize. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I can see some force in this argument when you narrow the scope down to this is for a particular person in mind that we have this argument for. I can see why this argument would be forceful for someone like that, but you do talk about some ways of pushing back in the paper. So why don't you go over that now?
Okay, cool. So one way is just to put some pressure on her notion of optimism, right? And one way to do, as I mentioned previously, one way to sort of just respond to this argument is to reject optimism altogether. And that's something that she's willing to endorse. Well, not endorse. She says if your response is to reject optimism, then the argument is not for you. You're not the target of the argument. Another response is to reject the kind of robust optimism that she has. Right? She talks about weaker accounts of optimism that you may have, and the question then for the atheist or the agnostic would be whether the weaker kinds of optimism is something that you'll be satisfied with, that you find sufficiently appealing. And she thinks that in general it is not, right? But in some sense, that might be an empirical question as well that's worth investigating a bit further. One way I think that, so while you might challenge this idea of optimism, I think that as an argument structure, you can kind of develop this argument by considering alternative accounts of sort of pro attitudes towards life, right? So you may run sort of a pragmatic argument from Horrendous Evils for optimism. In a recent paper, Eugene Nagasawa talks about existential optimism, and in that version, he talks about existential optimism in the sense of gratitude, right? That the world is sort of overall a good place, and that we think that we should be grateful for our existence in it in some way. And you can think of sort of various other kinds of pro attitudes towards life that you can sort of swap out for optimism. Yeah, and any of those may be sort of useful ways of thinking about the way that this argument runs. Okay, so that's the first way to sort of challenge or develop this argument. The second way is to, sorry, were you going to say
No,
something about?
no, this is
Yeah.
good. Keep going.
Okay. So the second way is to think about this idea of a horror defeater. And I think this is particularly interesting. You might ask Adams what she means by a horror defeater. So here's one challenge. Um, what exactly does this horror defeater need to do? Is it sufficient that horrors are defeated in the sense that horrors are removed? Or are you instead requiring something like a horror redeemer or a horror compensation? What exactly is needed in order to get the kind of optimism that she wants, right? And the other thing that you might be concerned about is that she gets from this idea of a horror defeater to the god of the biblical religion really quickly. Yeah. In her defense, it's worth saying that again that I think that this paper is part of a much larger project that she has, right? And so while the move in the paper might be quick, understanding her project would help make a bit more sense of sort of the strategy that she's taking. But one way, but you may, in my view, you might impose certain constraints to try and make sense of what this horror defeater needs to do, right? So you might think that in order to sort of be a horror defeater that is sufficiently relevant and satisfying to provide such optimism, it needs to have at least three attributes. Number one, this horror defeater needs to be able to defeat horrors. Number two, it needs to be willing to defeat horrors. And number three, it should have given us some reason to think that horrors will be defeated one day. And each of these seem to me to be important conditions. And based on this, you might then sort of develop this argument by considering various ways of cashing out what this horror defeater might look like. Right? Might there be sort of different pictures of theism that fill this role better and fill this role less well? I had two more ways that I thought. Is there time for this? Do you
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's spend no more than about 8 more minutes on this
Okay.
argument, and then we'll move to the final one.
Okay. So sort of a third way to approach and respond to this argument is to look at premise four. And I think this response is something that I think is personally interesting because of other work that I do, which is, might there be an objection from within theism to think that, in fact, a horror defeater might give, you might be skeptical that a horror defeater might give theism a reason to be optimistic. So there's a huge literature, often called anti-theodicism, right? So you have anti-theodicists who argue that there are senses in which horrors can never be defeated, right? So John Roth, for example, argues that too much has been lost. He calls them wasteful evil, such that they can never be redeemed, never be compensated for, right? Some anti-theodicists argue that creating theological narratives such as this, right? So I think both Marilyn Adams and Eugene Nagasawa talks about one way that theism seems to perform much better than naturalism on this account is that it provides some hope, right, for a better future, where the horrors are redeemed, the horrors are compensated for, and so on and so forth. And some anti-theodicists argue that constructing such theological narratives have the potential to increase the suffering rather than reduce the suffering of victims by sort of providing a dialectic to interpret, the victim's suffering on their behalf, right? And so that may be a concern that you may raise from within the camp. I pulled out a quote here from Dostoevsky, right? So he has Ivan Karamazov say this. But how will you redeem them? Is it possible? Can they be redeemed by being avenged? But what do I care if they are avenged? What do I care if the tormentors are in hell? What can hell set right here if these ones have already been tormented, right? And sort of the idea there, I think, is that you might have some worries that putting suffering in such a clear scheme, right, might, or at least anti-theodicists worry that putting suffering in such a scheme such as this might increase the evils done to sufferers rather than reduce it, right? Yeah. Sort of in response to that, I think a response to that worry would be a standard response to anti-theodicists, which is to distinguish between theodicies and the communication of theodicies, right? So theodicies so I think Adlai Sovik talks about this, where theodicies in and of themselves are not something that's harmful, but when communicated in an insensitive manner, they immediately become harmful. Right, and that might be an interesting response. Another way to develop this premise for is to consider whether theism, whichever theism you're concerned about, has additional resources, right, beyond the utopic future to compensate and redeem these horrors.
So briefly, I'm not sure I followed the point on. I understand. I think anyway, I understand the difference between the theodicy and the communication of the theodicy. It wasn't totally clear how that's supposed to solve this worry. Can you expand on that?
Okay, good, thanks. So the worry is something like if we have a theodicy that says something like we can that you can achieve sort of a bit more optimism in your life, right? And by optimism, this idea of positive meaning making in your life, by appeal to sort of a utopic future, right? That one day all your suffering will be redeemed, it will be compensated for. The worry that anti-theodicists have, right? At least one worry that anti-theodicists have will be that story itself is sometimes harmful to victims. And the response to that, sort of the distinction that we're then drawing, is that the story itself is not something that's harmful. It's the wrongful communication of the story that's harmful.
Okay. Right. I think I get it now. I gotcha. Okay. Why don't we're about at the point where we need to switch to the next argument. Is it okay with you if we go ahead and switch?
Yeah. Maybe it's worth. Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
So maybe it's worth saying that there are various ways to run this argument, and one way to do that is just to consider the kind of conclusion that we're concerned about, right? So the conclusion that we're trying to, at least in the argument structure that we have for the second argument, the conclusion is something like, therefore we ought to believe in a horror defeater. But there are sort of various ways to tweak this based on the kind of project that you're interested in. Right, so one tweak would be something like, instead of saying we ought to believe in a horror defeater, we might say we would like there to be a horror defeater, right? And I think Liz Jackson takes this approach where instead of thinking about a horror defeater, she says something like, we would like there to be cosmic justice, right? And whether you think that kind of argument is a good one depends very much on your view on things like the way pragmatic reasons for belief interact with epistemic reasons for belief as well. Yeah, so yeah. That's all. Yeah.
There's a talk for sure online, I think Capturing Christianity put it out, where Liz defends that style of argument. So I'll put a link in the description to that. Okay, let's go ahead and shift to the third argument here. So this one is the argument from reasonable responses to horrendous evils. 1. The protest response to horrendous evils is a reasonable one. 2. The condition for the protest response is an expectation that the world ought not be this way. 3. Under the naturalistic picture of the world, there is no way the world ought to be, merely a way that the world is. 4. Under the theistic picture of the world, there is a way that the world ought to be. 5. Consequently, the condition for the protest response is a theistic picture of the world.
Okay, so this is the argument that might be, in a sense, the least developed. in the sense that we're pulling it up from various shorter works. But it is an argument that I find particularly interesting. And maybe I'll say a bit about the motivation, right? So much of the intuition behind this argument came from reading things like Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, Elie Wiesel's Trial of God, and a book I wholeheartedly recommend called Wrestling with God by Katz, Biderman, and Greenberg. And these are sort of ways that people who have gone through horrendous evils respond to horrendous evils, right? Maybe a more popular way, slogan that people use would be something like, no one deserves to suffer this much, right? Okay. And so one of the things that then comes out is that there are certain responses to evils that seem reasonable, right? In this case, what we're sort of highlighting is the idea of a protest response, right? And so Miroslav Volf talks about this. The argument can be one quick way to sort of just develop this argument or change up this argument is to change the kind of response that we're concerned about, right? So Miroslav Volf talks about a protest response. I think Plantinga talks about something like a revulsion response, right? I think you can find sort of responses of resentment and revolt as well towards horrendous evils that we think are generally reasonable responses to have. These are sort of natural responses, and it's worth paying attention to sort of, I think, our reactive attitudes or our moral emotions in response to horrendous evils. But when you reflect on these emotions, things like resentment, these acts of protest, you begin to realize that these responses seem to assume an expectation that the world ought to be a certain way. One question then would be, can you provide a naturalistic account for why we might have reason to think the world ought to be a way that is different from the way it currently is, right? So suppose you wanted to challenge this argument, you might stop at premise. You might consider premise 3, right, and provide an alternative, naturalistic or non-theistic account to explain why we might have reasons to expect the world to be a certain way, right? In response to this, premise 3 might be a way to challenge the argument, but you might develop the argument by doubling down on premise 3, right? So instead, the theist might then instead try and demonstrate that the best naturalistic or best non-theistic accounts cannot provide this expectation that undergirds such responses as well. Yeah, and so this is sort of one of those inference to the best explanation kind of projects, right? Where you examine competing best naturalistic or non-theistic accounts of the way the world ought to be, and to conclude that theism still wins out at the end. Maybe
all I was going to ask was, ways of pushing back. I can already think of one, but I want you to go ahead and lay out, and you will most likely hit on the one that I'm thinking of. So go ahead and talk about pushback here.
So I think maybe the most common pushback that I've got is on premise 4, right? So I'm not sure if this is what you have in mind, but for many theists then adopt something like the best of all possible worlds kind of theodicy, in which case the world that is exactly the way the world ought to be. And so you might be concerned that the theists might not be able to endorse premise 4.
That's a creative. That wasn't the.
Oh, okay.
I was going to pick on premise 3, but I guess if you think that this world is the best possible world, or if you, which I don't know that many theists are going to endorse that, but if you think that it's the best possible world, or if you think that maybe it's like either tied for the best possible world, or maybe it just meets some threshold. It's not the best that there could be, but it meets some threshold.
Yeah.
Then it seems like maybe on any of those, the theist might say, should I really say that this world isn't the way that it ought to be? I don't know. I think the theist could probably say some things. Yeah, you might want to say, like, what might the theist say in response to that? It seems like the theist has some potential ways to respond to that.
Yeah, it seems like it depends very much on the various theistic commitments you have, right? So here's one approach a theist may take. A theist may distinguish between what's sometimes called the secret will of God and the revealed will of God, right? And the revealed will of God tells you something like what beforehand, what we know about God, what God commands, and what God says a good world will look like. And the secret will of God is something like the way that, God actually works in the world. And if we align our moral emotions and our expectations of the world to the revealed will, right, rather than the secret will, then you might think that there is a way that you think that the world ought to be, which is different from the way the world is, right? But there are various ways of distinguishing between the will of God, right? That the theist might have some resources in doing, right, and sort of resist the best of all possible worlds kind of objection. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So a different way of pushing back, I'll just leave that one there for now for the sake of time, because we're coming up on about an hour. A different way of pushing back, I was going to push back on premise 3. So under the naturalistic picture of the world, there is no way that the world ought to be, merely a way that the world is. It seems like the same sorts of defenses of maybe moral realism that someone had in mind when they objected to that first argument we talked about. Here they can say, even on naturalism, there is a way that the world ought to be. There are still obligations. There's still moral obligations. And so why should I accept premise 3? Yeah, what do you think about that?
Good. I think that's a very interesting objection. Certainly, someone who you might think that we do indeed have certain moral obligations, even if God does not exist, right? And does that suggest that there is a way that the world ought? Does that suggest that there's a certain expectation we should have of the way that the world ought to be? I don't think so. I think it tells you what we could hope the world ought to be like, but I'm not sure that it gives you a way to expect, right, the world to be a better place than it currently is. It gives us a reason to think that the world could be better, even a reason to think the world should be better, but not a reason to expect that the world should be better.
I see. Yeah. So in that case, the naturalist would say, yes. I'm thinking of the naturalist that affirms moral realism.
Yeah.
Would say, yes, the world should go a certain way, but there aren't good grounds for expecting it to go that way. If anything, we've got really good grounds to think it's going to be really crummy in many ways. Okay, I see what you're saying there.
Or that the world should be different than it currently is, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Maybe just one last thing in response to this. So I think a lot of this argument on moral emotions hinges on the idea of having a certain expectation. And there's a bunch of ways that you may explore developing this notion of expectation, right? I'll just mention 2 that I think is particularly interesting. C.S. Lewis, for example, talks about the certain desires that we might have of the world being a different way. And that itself is something that I think is interesting to explore. And Simone Weil talks about this idea of having a profound and childlike and unchanging expectation of good in us. Why do we have such an expectation? The theistic account is going to say something like, because we think that the world ought to be a certain way. God should have created the world a certain way, or from what we know about God, we would expect the world to be slightly different from what it currently is. Yeah.
All right. Well, that puts us at 50 minutes, so it's probably a good time to start wrapping up.
Okay.
So thank you for coming on. I really enjoyed this. And do you have anything you want to say to sum up this discussion?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jordan. I think this was really fun. Maybe just two quick parting thoughts. First of all, I think this is a really, thinking and talking about horrendous evils. This is a difficult and a really complex topic. And it's worth saying, I think, that sometimes theists use these explanations and arguments to interpret sufferings for sufferers. And it's worth saying, I think, that these arguments are not meant to do that, right? That's not the point of the paper, not the point of the argument. In fact, the wide literature we have on anti-theodicies might suggest that such attempts might, at the very least, be irritating and annoying. And what is needed, for sufferers of horrendous evil sometimes is not philosophy per se, but as I think Alvin Plantinga points out, something like comfort, companionship, and counsel, as something that's slightly more important, right? So I think part of the idea is that recognizing the complexity of this topic, one response should not be to too quickly simplify some of the discussions here. And well, the second thing that I wanted to say is, in some sense, the paper is an invitation, right, for anyone who finds any of these arguments interesting and meaningful to sort of explore ways that arguments may be further developed, further strengthened, and sort of trying to find sort of best possible versions of the arguments. And in fact, those who want to challenge these arguments should also find best possible versions of the arguments to challenge. So I'll be very, if anyone's interested in that, I'm definitely happy to chat a bit more.
All right. Well, thank you all for watching, and keep exploring Christianity.